In the 1940s, I was a AT&W railroad employee on the narrow gauge part of the line. I was I was an engineer just about to be promoted. My senior engineer, Frank Coffey, would be teaching me how to run the locomotive and would be my trainer. I would be running locomotive number 11 on this particular night that this event happened. I was getting the engine ready around 7:30 this night, preparing the fire and getting the pressure up on the engine when I heard a whistle I had never heard before in the distance. It was deeper than most of the 5-inch Crosbys or Baldwin 3 chimes that the locomotives usually sported. It sounded almost like a 6-inch Crosby, but deeper. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, as I was usually afraid of the dark. Once the fire was built up, I took number 11 out of the yards and headed towards Elizabethton. The locomotive began to handle weirdly and began to have problems steaming up the hill, even though I had tackled this grade a couple more different times with my senior trainer, and I never had hardly any issues. Me and my fireman stopped to find that the piston had actually come loose. So me and him began to do work to the engine when I heard another deep whistle. This time it was much closer behind us, almost as if it was coming up straight behind us. I then began to hear chuffing and bell ringing. I ran over to the back of the consist to see steam arching over the horizon, but I could not see a locomotive. I was confused and actually kind of scared at this, so I had never heard a whistle like this on the railroad before, unless if one of the engineers had decided to bring one of their personal ones in. But even then, why would that be a 6-inch Crosby on a tiny little 460 Baldwin? Anyways, me and my friend would continue to run the train and would limp it up to Elizabethton and would store it there for the night for service the next morning. The next morning, me and him repaired the 11 in record time and would back all the way back down the mountain down to our starting point in Cranberry and would get the locomotive re-fired up and ready to pull the next train. This time we'd start up later in the night at around 9 o'clock. We would be firing up the 11 until I was given a call by one of our safety managers that there had been a runaway locomotive spotted going over the trestle. I got in my car and drove as fast as I could to the trestle. Keep in mind, this was 1949, and cars were not very powerful back then, so it took me quite a long time to get there compared to how it would now. I went to the trestle, and there was no sign of any steam that had been left behind by an engine. Not yet. Fast forward to about 5 to 10 minutes after I got to the trestle, I began to hear chuffing. I at first thought my fireman and a different engineer had taken the engine to at least the trestle so that I wouldn't have to drive all the way back. But then I heard that same deep Crosby. I was confused. I didn't know what to think. I began to wonder if I was going crazy, but once I heard the whistle begin to pierce the air, I knew I wasn't. It was this deep, mellow, haunting, deadly tone. It sounded unlike any of the whistles the ET and WNC owned at the time. It was so haunting, I got goosebumps just hearing it, and the bell was nothing I'd ever heard before. I could definitely tell this was definitely some other engine that I had not been made aware of. The engine finally appeared. It looked just like 11 and 12 of the other engines, but it was a darker black color with a really weird shade of black surrounding it. The engine stopped at the trestle. I was a little concerned and kind of curious too, so I walked over to the black engine. I looked at the number plate to see something that noticeably caught me off guard, number 13. I had no recollection of the railroad ever acquiring a locomotive 13 or even ever owning one, as I was told by my senior trainer that the 13 was an unlucky number and was never built. I began to get this indescribable feeling. It was like a feeling of terror and a creepy feeling in a way. I looked at the number plate again to make sure I wasn't seeing things, and it sure enough said 13. I then decided to walk over to the cab to see if there was anyone inside. Not a person in sight. I got up in the cab to find that the fire was hot, much hotter than normal, almost as hot as a bonfire. This fire was unnaturally hot for a locomotive. Not even 12 or 11's fire burn this hot when even at the hottest power I could get it. I was actually kind of concerned that the boiler was going to blow, but it was at 180 psi at perfect alignment with the popping valve. It was a perfect pressure balancing. Then I heard a voice call my name. I looked over to see a black figure standing behind me where the engineer seat is. I asked the figure who he was and to explain himself, but he didn't respond. I jumped. He began to come towards me with a knife. I got off the engine and fled for it. I ran as far as I could into the woods, leaving my car behind, not caring in the world about what would happen to it. I ran about 13 miles down the line and stopped at a piece of land where we'd often stop to take on water at a pond nearby. I began to hear that familiar, sickening, deep 3 chime in the distance. I had had enough of this and decided I was going to take care of this myself. The engine crested the horizon as I could see the black engine work going unnaturally fast, much faster than I have ever seen a locomotive on the line go. It had to be going at least 13 to 25, 30, maybe even 50 miles an hour or faster. I decided enough was enough and caught the cab. The engineer looked at me, and his eyes, there were no eyes. He had none. His soulless, blank expression stared into my soul. I will never forget this. He looked up at me and said, "This is your last chance to leave." And then he would lunge at me. I would pull out my pistol and shoot him 3 times, killing him. And I took control of the engine before I realized we were about to go over a broken bridge. I jumped off the locomotive, breaking my arm. The engine would plummet over the bridge, blowing up, and the freight train going down with it. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. Was this a dream? I thought to myself.